Did you know that one single battle destroyed the entire empire of Napoleon Bonaparte? This battle changed the history of Europe. It happened in the year 1815. The place was a quiet area near Brussels. Today, this place is in Belgium. But on that day, it became a battlefield. For many years, Napoleon had ruled France. He was one of the greatest military commanders in history. His armies had conquered much of Europe. Kings and emperors feared his power. But eventually, his enemies united against him. They formed a powerful alliance. This alliance included Britain. It also included Prussia. Other European nations supported them. Napoleon was forced to give up power once before. He was exiled to the island of Elba. But Napoleon was not finished. He escaped from exile. He returned to France. Thousands of soldiers joined him again. Many people still believed in him. Napoleon quickly regained control of France. This period became known as the 100 Days, but the European powers refused to accept him again. They prepared for war. Their goal was simple: defeat Napoleon forever. Napoleon knew he had to act quickly. He planned to attack before the Allied armies united. His strategy was bold. He would defeat the enemy armies one by one. His main opponents were the British Army. The British Army was led by Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington. Another army belonged to Prussia. The Prussian army was led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Both armies were moving toward France. Napoleon moved first. His army marched into Belgium. His soldiers were experienced veterans. Many had fought with him for years. They trusted their emperor. Napoleon believed victory was still possible. But time was running out. If the British and Prussian armies joined together, the war would be lost. So Napoleon planned to defeat them separately. The campaign began in June 1815. French troops crossed the border. Villages and towns suddenly became war zones. Civilians watched the armies pass by. Thousands of soldiers marched through muddy roads. Cannons rolled across the countryside. The sound of drums filled the air. War had returned to Europe. Napoleon's army first clashed with the Prussians. A battle took place at Ligny. Napoleon won that battle. The Prussian army retreated, but they were not destroyed. This would later become very important. Meanwhile, the British army moved carefully. Wellington chose strong defensive positions. He knew Napoleon was dangerous. He prepared for a major confrontation. The final battlefield was chosen. It was near a small village called Waterloo. Fields and farms surrounded the area. Small hills shaped the terrain. These hills would help the defenders. On June 17th, heavy rain fell all night. The battlefield turned into mud. Soldiers struggled to move equipment. Cannons became difficult to fire. Both armies waited for the morning. They knew a decisive battle was coming. For Napoleon, this was a chance to save his empire. For the Allies, this was the chance to end him. Thousands of soldiers prepared for combat. Many would not survive the day. The sun slowly rose on June 18th. The Battle of Waterloo was about to begin. Morning light slowly spread across the battlefield. The ground was still wet from the night rain. Mud covered the roads and fields. Soldiers looked across the quiet valley. Both armies prepared for the coming fight. Thousands of men stood in long lines. Cannons were carefully placed on the hills. Officers gave their final instructions. Everyone knew the battle would be brutal. Silence filled the air for a moment. Then the first cannon fired. The sound echoed across the countryside. The Battle of Waterloo had begun. Smoke slowly covered parts of the field. French artillery opened heavy fire. Cannons roared again and again. Explosions shook the ground. Soldiers tightened their ranks. Across the field stood the army of Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington. His troops waited behind the ridge. The hill helped protect them from cannon fire. This was a clever defensive plan. Wellington remained calm. He watched the battlefield carefully. He knew Napoleon was a dangerous opponent. Meanwhile, Napoleon Bonaparte observed everything from a distance. He studied the enemy lines. He searched for weaknesses. His generals waited for orders. Napoleon finally made his first move. He ordered an attack on a farm. The farm was called Hougoumont. It stood on the right side of the battlefield. Allied soldiers defended the buildings. French troops marched toward the farm. Gunfire erupted immediately. The battle around Hougoumont became intense. Soldiers fought among trees and walls. Smoke filled the air. Flames began to rise from the buildings. Despite many attacks, the defenders held their ground. The farm refused to fall. This battle lasted for hours. It slowly drained French strength. Meanwhile, the main armies still faced each other. Napoleon prepared a larger attack. He ordered infantry divisions forward. French soldiers marched in massive columns. Drums beat loudly. Flags waved in the wind. The soldiers advanced across the muddy field. Enemy cannons fired directly at them. Explosions tore through the ranks. Many soldiers fell, but the columns kept moving. They moved closer to the Allied lines. Suddenly, musket fire erupted. British soldiers fired volley after volley. The noise was deafening. Smoke covered everything. French soldiers tried to push forward, but the Allied line held firm. The attack slowed down. Some units began to retreat. Napoleon realized the battle would not be easy. Wellington's defense was strong. The battlefield was becoming chaotic. Messengers rushed between commanders. Orders were shouted across the lines. Cavalry waited for their moment. Artillery continued firing nonstop. Every minute the casualties increased. The battle was far from over. In the distance, something important was happening. A new army was moving toward the battlefield. It was the army of Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The Prussians were marching fast. They wanted to help the Allies. Napoleon did not yet know how close they were, but their arrival would change everything. The fate of Europe was still uncertain, and the day was only beginning. The battlefield grew louder with every passing minute. Smoke covered much of the valley. Soldiers could barely see far ahead. The roar of cannons never stopped. Gunfire echoed from every direction. The Battle of Waterloo was now fully underway. French commanders searched for new opportunities. They believed the Allied line might break. Napoleon Bonaparte watched the battle carefully. He noticed movement among the enemy ranks. Some Allied soldiers were shifting positions. Napoleon thought the enemy might be retreating. He decided to act quickly. He ordered a massive cavalry attack. Thousands of French horsemen prepared to charge. Their armor shined in the sunlight. Their swords were ready. The signal was given. The cavalry began to move. Hooves thundered across the muddy ground. The charge quickly gained speed. Dust and mud flew everywhere. The cavalry rushed toward the Allied positions. It was a terrifying sight. But Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, was prepared. He quickly ordered his infantry to form squares. Soldiers stood in tight formations. Bayonets pointed outward in every direction. These squares were designed to stop cavalry. The French horsemen reached the first lines. They circled the squares again and again, but they could not break them. Gunfire exploded from inside the formations. Many horses fell. Many riders were thrown to the ground. Still, the cavalry kept charging. Wave after wave attacked the squares. The battlefield became even more chaotic. Cannons continued firing through the smoke. Explosions shook the ground. Men shouted orders everywhere. The cavalry attacks lasted for a long time, but the Allied infantry refused to break. The defensive squares held strong. French losses slowly increased. Napoleon began to grow impatient. He wanted a decisive victory, but the battle was turning into a long struggle. Meanwhile, far away, another army continued marching. It was the Prussian army. They were led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Their soldiers moved quickly toward the battlefield. They could already hear distant cannon fire. They knew the battle had begun. Blücher pushed his men forward. He wanted to reach Wellington as soon as possible. Back at Waterloo, the fighting continued. Both sides were exhausted. The sun slowly moved across the sky. Hours of combat had already passed. The ground was covered with smoke and mud. Many soldiers were wounded. Many others had fallen. Yet neither side was ready to give up. Napoleon still believed victory was possible. Wellington remained calm under pressure. He stood among his troops. He encouraged them to hold the line. Every moment mattered. The arrival of reinforcements could decide everything. In the distance, dark columns began to appear. Some French officers noticed movement on the horizon. They were unsure who those soldiers were. But soon the truth would become clear. A new phase of the battle was about to begin. The fate of Napoleon's empire was hanging by a thread, and the most decisive moment was still ahead. The battle continued with relentless intensity. Smoke covered the rolling fields. The air smelled of gunpowder. The sound of cannons never faded. Men shouted orders across the chaos. The Battle of Waterloo was reaching a critical stage. French troops regrouped for another assault. Officers rode quickly across the lines. They carried new instructions from Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon still believed victory was within reach. He ordered his infantry to prepare again. Drums began to beat across the French ranks. Soldiers lifted their muskets. They marched forward once more. Across the field, the Allied army remained ready. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, watched every movement carefully. He stayed behind the protective ridge. His strategy was simple: hold the line at all costs. French artillery opened another powerful barrage. Cannons thundered across the valley. Explosions tore into the Allied positions. Soil and smoke filled the sky. Some units were shaken by the impact, but the Allied lines still held. Soon French infantry advanced again. Their columns moved slowly through the mud. Enemy cannon fire struck them again and again. Still they continued marching forward. The distance between the armies shrank. Musket fire suddenly erupted. Both sides began firing rapidly. Lines of smoke spread across the battlefield. The fighting became fierce. Men fell on both sides. Officers struggled to maintain order. French soldiers pushed toward the ridge, but the defenders resisted stubbornly. The hill still protected Wellington's troops. Every attack cost the French more men. Napoleon searched for another opportunity. He needed to break the Allied center. Without that breakthrough, victory was impossible. Meanwhile, distant sounds echoed from the east. A new army was approaching the battlefield. It was the Prussian army. They were led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Their soldiers were marching rapidly. They had recovered after their earlier defeat. Now they were coming to support the Allies. Napoleon's scouts soon noticed the movement. Reports quickly reached the French headquarters. Napoleon realized the danger. If the Prussians joined the battle, everything could change. He needed to delay them. So he sent part of his army to intercept them. French troops moved toward the approaching force. A new battle began on the eastern side of the field. Gunfire soon echoed in that direction. Napoleon hoped this would buy him time. But time was running out. Back in the main battlefield, the fighting continued. Wellington's soldiers stood firm. They had already survived many attacks, yet the pressure continued to grow. French artillery kept firing. Cavalry moved across the fields again. Infantry prepared for another assault. The battlefield had become a scene of destruction. Broken weapons lay everywhere. Smoke and dust covered the horizon. Thousands of soldiers were still fighting. Neither side was willing to surrender. But the arrival of the Prussians would soon change everything. The decisive moment of the battle was approaching. The battlefield had become a scene of chaos. Smoke covered the fields. Broken weapons lay everywhere. The sound of cannons never stopped. Men shouted orders in every direction. The Battle of Waterloo was now entering its most brutal phase. French soldiers prepared for another attack. They were tired but determined. Their emperor still believed in victory. Napoleon Bonaparte watched the field carefully. He knew time was running out. Reports about the approaching Prussians worried him. Still, he refused to give up. He ordered another powerful assault. French infantry advanced again. They moved through mud and smoke. Their drums echoed across the valley. Across the ridge, the Allied army waited. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, remained calm. He encouraged his soldiers to stand firm. His troops had already faced many attacks, but they were determined to hold their ground. Soon musket fire erupted again. Both armies exchanged deadly volleys. The battlefield filled with thick smoke. Visibility became difficult. Soldiers fought almost blindly. Cannons fired at close range. Explosions shook the earth. The fighting became desperate. Every step forward cost many lives. French troops slowly pushed toward the Allied lines. For a moment, the defenders seemed to weaken. Some Allied units began to fall back. French officers saw an opportunity. They urged their soldiers forward. Napoleon hoped this was the turning point. But Wellington quickly reacted. He moved fresh units into position. The defensive line formed again. The Allied army refused to collapse. Meanwhile, the distant battle in the east grew louder. The Prussian army was getting closer. They were led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Their soldiers marched with determination. They knew the fate of Europe depended on this battle. French troops tried to stop them, but the Prussians kept advancing. Gunfire echoed across the eastern fields. Back at the main battlefield, the struggle continued. Both sides were exhausted. Many soldiers had been fighting for hours. The ground was covered with mud and blood. Still the battle raged on. Napoleon looked for one final opportunity. He knew a decisive strike was needed. Without it, the battle could be lost. Wellington also understood the situation. He knew help was coming, but he had to hold the line until then. His soldiers remained steady. Every moment they resisted made a difference. The afternoon sun slowly moved across the sky. The battle had lasted many long hours, yet the final outcome was still uncertain. Soon everything would depend on one final gamble. Napoleon was preparing his most powerful attack. The fate of his empire now hung in the balance. The afternoon sun hung low over the battlefield. The fighting had lasted for many exhausting hours. Smoke still covered the fields. The ground was torn apart by artillery fire. The Battle of Waterloo was approaching its most decisive moment. Napoleon Bonaparte studied the battlefield carefully. He knew the situation was becoming dangerous. Reports continued to arrive from the eastern flank. The Prussian army was getting closer. Napoleon needed to win quickly. He could not allow the enemy armies to unite. So he began planning a final breakthrough. French commanders gathered around him. They listened carefully to his orders. Napoleon decided to launch another massive attack. This time he aimed at the center of the Allied army. He believed the enemy line might finally collapse. Fresh French troops were brought forward. Drums began to beat again. Officers raised their swords. Soldiers prepared for another advance. Across the ridge, the Allied army watched closely. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, understood what was coming. He moved more troops into the center. He strengthened defensive positions. Cannons were placed carefully along the ridge. Soon the French artillery began firing again. Explosions thundered across the valley. Soil and smoke flew high into the air. Then the French infantry began their march. Long columns of soldiers moved forward. Their uniforms were covered with mud. Their faces showed exhaustion. Yet they continued advancing. Allied cannons fired directly at them. Many soldiers fell along the way. Still the columns pushed forward. The distance between the armies closed again. Suddenly musket fire erupted. Gunshots echoed across the battlefield. Both sides fired rapidly. The fighting became extremely fierce. Men struggled to hold their positions. Officers shouted desperate commands. The French attack nearly reached the ridge. For a brief moment, the Allied center looked vulnerable. Napoleon watched with hope. He believed the breakthrough was close. But Wellington refused to retreat. He personally rode across the battlefield. He encouraged his soldiers to stay strong. The Allied line held once again. French troops began to lose momentum. Their attack slowed down. Casualties continued to rise. Meanwhile, the sounds of battle in the east became louder. The Prussian army was now arriving in large numbers. They were led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Their soldiers attacked the French flank. New fighting erupted near the village of Plancenoit. French troops rushed to defend the area. Napoleon realized the danger immediately. His army was now fighting on two fronts. Pressure began to grow across the battlefield. Yet Napoleon still had one final option. He still had his most elite soldiers. The Imperial Guard had not yet been used. These troops were famous across Europe. They were the best soldiers in the French army. Napoleon knew the moment had come. He prepared to send them into battle. This would be his final gamble. The fate of the entire war now depended on it. The battlefield was shaking with constant explosions. Smoke drifted slowly across the valley. The air was heavy with gunpowder. The Battle of Waterloo had reached a desperate stage. French soldiers were fighting on multiple fronts. Their strength was slowly fading, yet the battle was not over. Napoleon Bonaparte still searched for victory. He knew he had one final weapon. His most elite soldiers were waiting. They were called the Imperial Guard. These men were the pride of the French army. They had fought in many famous battles. Across Europe, their reputation was legendary. Napoleon trusted them completely. But he hesitated for a moment. Sending them meant risking everything. Meanwhile, a new danger was growing. The Prussian army had finally arrived in large numbers. They were led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Their troops began attacking the French flank. Gunfire erupted near the village of Plancenoit. French soldiers rushed to defend the village. The fighting there became extremely fierce. Street by street, the soldiers fought. Houses were destroyed by cannon fire. Smoke rose above the village. French troops tried desperately to hold the position. Napoleon sent reinforcements to help them. But the Prussian pressure kept increasing. More Prussian soldiers continued to arrive. Their numbers grew larger every minute. The French army was slowly being stretched. Back at the main battlefield, the struggle continued. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, still held his defensive line. His soldiers were exhausted, but they refused to retreat. They knew the Prussians were helping them now. This gave them new confidence. Wellington carefully watched the French movements. He expected another major attack. Across the field, Napoleon made his decision. The time had come. He ordered the Imperial Guard to prepare. Elite soldiers gathered in formation. Their uniforms were still clean. Their discipline was unmatched. They marched forward slowly. Other French soldiers watched them with hope. Many believed these troops would bring victory. Drums echoed across the battlefield. The Imperial Guard began moving toward the Allied center. Their advance was calm and steady. Cannons fired around them. Smoke filled the air. Yet they continued marching. Wellington saw the movement immediately. He realized what Napoleon was doing. The final attack had begun. Allied officers quickly prepared their soldiers. Infantry moved into defensive positions. Muskets were loaded again. Everyone understood the importance of this moment. If the Guard broke through, the battle might be lost. If they failed, Napoleon's empire would fall. The tension across the battlefield was enormous. Thousands of soldiers waited for the next moment. History itself seemed to pause. The decisive clash was only seconds away. The final attack was about to begin. The battlefield had grown strangely tense. Smoke drifted slowly above the valley. Every soldier sensed the importance of the moment. The Battle of Waterloo was reaching its climax. The Imperial Guard marched forward. They moved in perfect formation. Their discipline was legendary. These soldiers had never been defeated before. Napoleon Bonaparte watched them carefully. He placed all his hope in this attack. If they succeeded, victory might still be possible. If they failed, everything would be lost. Across the ridge, the Allied army prepared for the impact. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, gave calm but firm orders. His soldiers waited silently. They held their muskets tightly. The Imperial Guard continued advancing. Their steps were steady. Their officers marched at the front. French artillery fired to support them. Cannon smoke filled the air again. The Guard slowly climbed the ridge. They were getting closer to the Allied line. Allied soldiers stayed hidden behind the hill. They waited patiently. The distance between the armies shrank. Soon the Guard reached the top of the ridge. At that moment, Wellington gave the command. Allied soldiers suddenly rose from their positions. Rows of muskets appeared at once. A powerful volley of gunfire exploded. The sound echoed across the battlefield. French soldiers in the front ranks fell immediately. Still, the Imperial Guard tried to advance. They fired back with their muskets. Another volley from the Allies followed. More French soldiers dropped to the ground. The Guard struggled to maintain formation. For the first time, uncertainty appeared among them. They had expected the enemy to break. Instead, the defenders stood strong. More Allied units joined the fight. Gunfire became constant. The Imperial Guard could not move forward. Their attack had stalled. Napoleon watched the scene with growing concern. His last hope was slipping away. Suddenly, some French soldiers began stepping backward. A rumor spread across the battlefield. People began shouting something shocking. The Guard was retreating. This moment changed everything. For the first time, panic appeared in the French army. Other units began losing confidence. The legend of the Imperial Guard had been broken. Meanwhile, the Prussian army was attacking harder. They were still led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Their soldiers pushed deeper into the battlefield. French forces were now under pressure everywhere. Napoleon realized the terrible truth. The battle was slipping out of his control. The collapse of his army had begun, and the end of his empire was now very close. The afternoon sun hung low over the battlefield. The fighting had lasted for many exhausting hours. Smoke still covered the fields. The ground was torn apart by artillery fire. The Battle of Waterloo was approaching its most decisive moment. Napoleon Bonaparte studied the battlefield carefully. He knew the situation was becoming dangerous. Reports continued to arrive from the eastern flank. The Prussian army was getting closer. Napoleon needed to win quickly. He could not allow the enemy armies to unite. So he began planning a final breakthrough. French commanders gathered around him. They listened carefully to his orders. Napoleon decided to launch another massive attack. This time he aimed at the center of the Allied army. He believed the enemy line might finally collapse. Fresh French troops were brought forward. Drums began to beat again. Officers raised their swords. Soldiers prepared for another advance. Across the ridge, the Allied army watched closely. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, understood what was coming. He moved more troops into the center. He strengthened the defensive positions. Cannons were placed carefully along the ridge. Soon the French artillery began firing again. Explosions thundered across the valley. Soil and smoke flew high into the air. Then the French infantry began their march. Long columns of soldiers moved forward. Their uniforms were covered with mud. Their faces showed exhaustion. Yet they continued advancing. Allied cannons fired directly at them. Many soldiers fell along the way. Still the columns pushed forward. The distance between the armies closed again. Suddenly musket fire erupted. Gunshots echoed across the battlefield. Both sides fired rapidly. The fighting became extremely fierce. Men struggled to hold their positions. Officers shouted desperate commands. The French attack nearly reached the ridge. For a brief moment, the Allied center looked vulnerable. Napoleon watched with hope. He believed the breakthrough was close. But Wellington refused to retreat. He personally rode across the battlefield. He encouraged his soldiers to stay strong. The Allied line held once again. French troops began to lose momentum. Their attack slowed down. Casualties continued to rise. Meanwhile, the sounds of battle in the east became louder. The Prussian army was now arriving in large numbers. They were led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. Their soldiers attacked the French flank. New fighting erupted near the village of Plancenoit. French troops rushed to defend the area. Napoleon realized the danger immediately. His army was now fighting on two fronts. Pressure began to grow across the battlefield. Yet Napoleon still had one final option. He still had his most elite soldiers. The Imperial Guard had not yet been used. These troops were famous across Europe. They were the best soldiers in the French army. Napoleon knew the moment had come. He prepared to send them into battle. This would be his final gamble. The fate of the entire war now depended on it. Night slowly fell over the battlefield. The guns were finally beginning to fall silent. The Battle of Waterloo had come to an end. The once powerful French army was now in full retreat. Soldiers moved through the darkness in confusion. Many had thrown away their weapons. Others searched for their missing comrades. The road away from the battlefield was crowded. Wagons, horses, and soldiers filled the muddy paths. Allied troops continued their pursuit. They pushed forward through the night. Victory was now certain for the Allies. Arthur Wellesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, watched the battlefield carefully. He knew the long struggle was finally over. His army had survived the greatest test of the war. Exhausted soldiers slowly rested after the fighting. Some looked across the silent battlefield. The cost of victory was everywhere. Thousands of wounded men still needed help. The fields were covered with the remains of battle. Broken weapons lay scattered across the ground. Cannon stood silent after hours of thunder. Meanwhile, Napoleon Bonaparte was leaving the battlefield. He realized that everything had changed. His last chance to save his empire was gone. The defeat was final. Napoleon rode away with a small group of soldiers. Behind him, his army was disappearing into the darkness. The dream of another victory had ended. Soon the news of the battle spread across Europe. People everywhere heard about the defeat. Kings and governments celebrated the victory. For years they had feared Napoleon's power. Now that fear was finally over. The Allied armies soon marched toward France. Napoleon returned to Paris, but his support was quickly disappearing. Even his own government knew the situation was hopeless. Napoleon was forced to give up power again. This time there would be no return. Soon he surrendered to the British. They decided he must never threaten Europe again, so they sent him far away into exile. His destination was the remote island of St. Helena. It was located far out in the Atlantic Ocean. Escape from that island was almost impossible. Napoleon spent the rest of his life there. The man who once ruled much of Europe was now alone. Years later, he died on that distant island. But his story never disappeared. Historians continued to study his campaigns. They analyzed his victories and his mistakes. Among all his battles, one stood above the rest. Waterloo became the symbol of his final defeat. It showed how quickly power can disappear. It showed how alliances can change history. The battlefield itself became famous. Visitors traveled to see the place where history changed. Monuments were built to remember the fallen. Stories of the battle were told for generations. Books and films retold the dramatic events. Students continued to learn about it in schools. The lessons of that day remained powerful. Great leaders can still fall. Even the strongest armies can be defeated. One single battle can change the fate of nations. And on June 18, 1815, that is exactly what happened. The empire of Napoleon came to an end, and the world entered a new chapter of history.